Hello guys! For Module 5 of your IT Elective 3 Game Analysis and Design, our topic is regarding scrolling shooter tutorial using GameMaker Studio. For the objectives, at the end of this lesson, students should be able to learn to use variables using drag and drop functionality of GameMaker Studio, learn how to create objects with multiple events and actions, learn how to create scrolling backgrounds, reappearing objects, and collision events. Learn how to develop a basic game based on the scrolling shooter game 1945. So first, scrolling shooter. Scrolling shooter are a very popular type of arcade action game and are also rather easy to create with a package like GameMaker. In a scrolling shooter, the player controls an object, for example, a plane, spaceship, or car, which moves over a scrolling background. Obstacles appear on the background that must be avoided and enemies appear that must be shot. Often, bonus objects appear that can be picked up for additional benefits. During the game, the number, variety, and strength of enemies increases, making it harder and harder to survive. So in this tutorial, we will be creating a scrolling shooter game called 1945, in which the player flies in a plane over a sea and enemy planes try to destroy the player. We will treat aspects like how to create the illusion of motion using scrolling backgrounds, how to create the plane, how to make enemies and bullets, how to deal with the score, with lives, and with damage of the plane. But first of all, we delve into a very important aspect of GameMaker that extends the possibilities considerably by the use of variables. Okay, so first, variables. Before we will actually create the scrolling shooter game, we need to delve into a bit of an important concept of GameMaker, the use of variables. These simple concepts will provide a very powerful mechanism to enable much more interesting gameplay. So what is a variable? It can best be seen as a property of an instance of an object. As you should know, there are certain properties we can indicate when we define an object. For example, we can set whether it is visible or whether it is a solid. There are also a number of actions that change certain properties. For example, there is an action to change the position of the speed of an instance. So each instance has a number such as properties, and there are also a number of global properties like the score that are not related to the individual instances. All properties are stored in so-called variables that have name. Here are some of the properties or variables that each instance has. So first, x, the x coordinate of the instance, y, the y coordinate of the instance, the x and y refers to the location of your object within the map or within your game room. Okay, so we're defining the location of your object or sprites or anything that you want to add on your game using the x and y coordinate. We have h, speed, horizontal speed in pixels per step. V speed, vertical speed in pixels per step. Direction, current direction of motion in degrees, 0 being right, and going anti-clockwise to 360 being right again. Speed, the current speed in this direction. Visible, whether the object is visible, usually the value is 1 or true, or invisible, most of the time which values either 0 or false. Solid, whether the object is solid, 1 or true for its value, or 0 or not if it's false. Okay? Here are some of the global variables. We have score, the current value of the score, lives, the current number of lives, health, the current health of the player defaults to 100. So the value of your health could be or could range from 0 to 100. Mouse underscore x or mouse x, the x coordinate of your mouse. Mouse underscore y or mouse y, the y coordinate of your mouse. We have room speed, the current FPS or frames per second of the room in steps per second. Okay. We also have your room caption. Caption shown in the window title. Last two, we have your room width, width of the room in pixels, and room height, height of the room in pixels. There are many more variables, both local for the instances and global, and all of them can be found in GameMaker's documentation. So there are actions which manipulate the value of certain variables, but we will see. You can also manipulate them directly. What is better, you can define your own variables and use this as well. So for variable actions, we have two of the variable actions available for you for the GameMaker Studio. So there are two important actions to deal with variables directly, which can be found on your control tab. So later we'll be using this two variable actions. The first one is the set value for your variable. The second one is to test the variable if it has a value. So set the value of a variable. With this action, you can change the value of a given variable. This can either be one of the built-in variables or your own variable. So you can specify the name of your variable and the new value. When you check the relative box, the given value is added to the current value of the variable. Please note that this can only be done if the variable already has an assigned value to it. Rather than providing a simple value for the variables, you can also give an expression. For example, to double the score, you could set the value of the variable score to value 2 multiplied by score. Next, if a variable has a value or this particular action is what we call test variable for GameMaker. With this action, you can check what the value of a particular variable is. If the value of the variable is equal to the number given, the question returns true and the next action or block of action is performed. If it is not equal, the next action or block of the action is not performed. Okay, when you're testing your variable using this component, it only executes the next action below it. But later we'll be discussing on how we can create conditional statements using the drag and drop functionality of GameMaker Studio. Okay. You can also indicate that the check should be whether the variable value is smaller than the given value or larger than the given value. Actually, you are not restricted to use variables, but you can check any expression you like. Later, we'll see a number of examples in the use of this action. So now let's proceed with the 1945 tutorial. But before we proceed on the actual tutorial, we'll be first proceeding with the 1945 overview. So what is 1945? 1945 is a scrolling shooter game. Okay, it is in this game a player controls a plane that can move within the game room. So the player can control the plane using the keyboard arrow keys and can use the space bar to fire bullets to enemies. The goal of the game is to shoot enemies without getting hit by enemy planes. If the player progresses through the game, the enemy planes starts growing in numbers rapidly, making the game complicated as the player continues to play. Each time an enemy plane is shot, the score is raised and the goal is to get the highest possible score. We have your simple game design document. So first, for the game objects, there will be two main objects for the game. So the controller plane and the enemy plane. The controller plane can move around the game and can fire bullets to destroy enemy planes. Enemy planes do not have the capability to fire off bullets but can destroy the controller plane by colliding itself, causing explosion and a deduction to the health of the controller plane. Each collision of the enemy plane will reduce the health of the controller plane by 30 points. The controller plane will have a full health of 100 points, making the controller plane survive up to 3 hits of collision. We have sound. The game will use 2 sound for the game. One for the explosion caused by bullets colliding into the enemy planes, and another one of the explosion caused by enemy planes colliding into the controller plane. We also have controls. The player can only control the controller plane using the arrow keys for movement and the space bar for firing bullets to the enemies. Gameplay. At the start of the game, the score is set to 0. The room with the controller plane and enemy plane is shown and the game immediately begins. The enemy flies down the room and reappears at the top when not destroyed by bullets or collision to the controller plane. So the player must shoot down the enemy plane to avoid collision that deducts score to the health, causing the game to be over. Lastly, we have levels. There is just one level, so the difficulty of the game increases as playtime goes by due to the increasing number of planes entering and reappearing into the game. Okay, so let's start the tutorial. So first, I'll be demonstrating to you what will be our final outcome. So this is the demo of our game. Okay, so let's compile it. So this is your game now. So as you can see in the bottom, you have your health, you have your score. Okay, then this is your controller plane. So when the controller plane collides, it explodes. You can also fire off bullets using the space bar, okay, to kill your enemies. So once the plane is hit 4 times, okay, the game will be over. So let's start this. Okay, so it will be prompting you that game is over. So when you click OK, the game will be restarted. Okay, so this is our demo, or this is the output of our tutorial. So let's recreate this. So to do that, we'll be proceeding with File, and let's create a new project. Okay, so I'll be selecting new, and I'll be renaming this project. So let's say, for example, I'll be renaming it to Demo 1945. Okay, so I'll be saving it in my C drive. Okay, and click create. Now, before we proceed in creating this game, we'll be needing files. So first, I have my assets in here. So these are the assets that I'll be using for the game. So these are the sprites. So let's say, for example, these are the sprites for your islands. Okay, you have your controller plane and enemy planes. Okay, so all these files that you'll be needing, or all these assets that you'll be needing to create this Demo 1945 game, I'll be attaching them onto the link below. Okay, so now let's proceed. So first thing that we need to settle in creating this scrolling shooter game is creating a scrolling background. Now, so to do that, before we proceed on designing the scrolling background, first we should have an image that we'll be using for as your background. So you can proceed in here. So this is your resource tree. Right click onto the backgrounds resource, select create background. Okay, so I'll be renaming this into let's say water underscore BG. Okay, then I'll be loading the image that we will be using. So in your assets folder, we'll be using this image. So this is your water.png. So this is a 32 by 32 pixel image, but don't worry. Okay, so this image we'll be reusing it, or we'll be using it as styles to cover our whole room. Okay, so just click open. Okay, then click OK. Now we already have your background. Okay, so your water BG. The next thing that we'll be doing now is we'll be proceeding to creating your room. So proceed into the room's resources. Right click into this. Okay, then create a room. Then after creating your room, we have several tabs that are in here. So we'll be proceeding with settings. So the first thing that we'll be doing now is we'll be naming your room. So let's say, for example, I'll be naming this to main underscore RM. Okay, so the suffix RM denotes that this resource is a room. Okay, so after doing that, we'll be proceeding to your backgrounds tab. Okay, now for your backgrounds tab, okay guys, so we'll be selecting your background now. So what I'll be doing now is I'll be clicking onto this button, okay, to load a background image. So we have your water underscore BG. Then as you can see, we already have your background now in here. Now, to create a scrolling background, okay, we need to define the vertical speed for your room. So for this particular example, we'll be adding 2 as your vertical speed. Okay, so let's check this. So let's click check, okay, to finalize all the changes that you did. Okay, then let's try to run your game and let's check your background. So this is now your room. Okay, so as you can see, the image is moving from top to down. So by adding vertical speed onto your background, so it'll be creating a scrolling background for your game. Okay, so this is the first step. We already have your scrolling background for the game. So the next thing that we'll be doing now is we'll be proceeding to the islands that we'll be adding for your room. So to do that, we'll be first starting with sprites. So I'll be creating a sprite for 3 islands. So I'll be renaming them to island underscore or island1 underscore SPR. Okay. Now, I'll be loading the image. So the image will be on your assets folder. So in here, we have three assets or three images or sprites for your island. So first, I'll be using this island number 1. Okay, then click open. Then the next thing that you're going to do is we'll be setting its origin into the center. So just click the center button and click OK. So all you need to do is to do this 2 more times with your island number 2. Okay. Island underscore SPR will be loading your image. Okay. Set your center to background, then click OK. Then let's create your third sprite, island3 underscore SPR. Okay. We'll be loading the island3 sprite. Set the center, so set the origin to center, then click OK. Now, okay, so after creating your sprites for your islands, the next thing that we'll be doing now is we'll be creating the objects for each of these corresponding sprites. So first, let's right-click your objects folder onto your resource tree, then select create object. Okay, then we'll be renaming this to island1 underscore obj. Obj denotes that this resource is an object. So we'll be assigning a corresponding sprite for your island1 obj. That will be your island1 SPR. Okay, then we'll be assigning a depth of 100 in here. So we'll be assigning the depth 100, okay, for this object to be drawn first into the stack. Okay, we want your island to be on the lowest part of the stack in your game. Okay, then we'll be proceeding to the add event. Okay, so just click your add event button, select create. Okay, then what we're going to do now is upon the creation of your island, we want your island to be scrolling along with your background. So to do that, we'll be attaching this vertical speed action. So under your move tab, select this vertical speed and drag it along the actions list. Okay, so we'll be assigning to as its vertical speed. Okay, then the next thing that we'll be doing is we want this object to be reappearing after it scrolls from top to bottom. Okay, so let's say for example the island is no longer being seen on the game. We want it to reappear on top. So to do that, okay, we'll be adding an additional event. So that will be your step event. So select onto the step button and select step. Okay, so this is your event now, step. So what we're going to do now is we'll be testing a variable. Okay, so we can proceed with control. Okay, so this variable, okay, or this action is your test variable. You can proceed to control and variables group. Okay, select test variable. Okay, so we'll be testing your variable. So we want to check what is the current location of your island in its y-axis. Okay, because we're moving from top to bottom, okay, we'll be using the y-axis to define the location of your island. So to do that, we'll be using y for the variable, and for the value, instead of using an integer, we'll be using a global variable. That will be your room height. Okay, so the question now is what's the height of your room? So you can proceed with or let's just finish the parameters that is needed for the test variable. Okay, so variable y, if value is room height, then the operation will be changing it to greater than. Okay, then click OK. Now, how can we know what is the height and width of your room? So you can double click the current room that you have. Okay, and you can proceed to the settings tab. You'll see in here, it is defined, or the width is defined as 640 by 480, and the speed is 30. So we have 30 steps per second, or 30 frames per second to be displayed on this game. Okay, so these are your basic configurations. So I'll just click OK. Okay. Then After testing your variable, if y is greater than your room height, meaning if your object is already outside the vertical limit of your room, that is 640, we want it to jump into a particular position. Okay, so you can proceed to move tab, okay, then select this action. This is jump to position. Okay, so we want your object, or we want your island object to reappear again. Okay, if its current location is greater than the room height. So what we'll be doing now is we'll be defining where will it appear. So as you can see, we have your x and y coordinate in here. So the values that we'll be using is for y, we'll be using negative 65. Negative 65 denotes that the location will come from above, okay, the room. Then, instead of using an integer value, guys, we'll be using a function that will be your random. Okay? Then the parameter for your function will be using the room underscore width. So it will randomize a value between 0 up until to the room width. Okay, so the room width is 480, so that the value will be around from 0 to 100. No, from 0 to 480. Okay, meaning it will reappear above using the negative 65. Okay, then the x coordinate or the horizontal location will be randomized. Okay, then we'll just click OK onto this. Okay, so as of now, we have two events. Just click OK. Then what we're going to do now is we'll be adding this island1 obj onto your room. Okay, now so to do that, first thing that we'll be doing is proceed with your objects tab, and in here, we'll be selecting the object that we want to add onto your room. So let's say, for example, after selecting your island number 1 obj, all you need to do now is to left click within your room where you want to add your object. So let's say, for example, I'll be adding my object onto the upper left corner of our room. So let's check what will be the output of the events and actions that we've added for your island number 1 or island 1 obj. I'll click check to finalize the changes, and let's try to run your game. So this is your game now. So as you can see, the island is scrolling along with the background. So let's check if it will reappear above. Okay, so it reappears again in here. So it moves slightly onto the right. So let's wait. Where will it reappear again? Okay. So now, as you can see, your island move onto this part of the map. Okay. How did that happen? So basically, we defined it using the step event in the jump to position. Okay. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the negative 65 value denotes that the island will reappear above. Okay. For the x coordinate, okay, it will appear randomly between the values 0 to the room width. That will be your 480 pixels, because our room is defined as to 640 pixels by 480 pixels. Okay, so you already have your first island, okay, scrolling island. So what we're going to do now is we'll be excuse me, we'll be repeating the same procedure for island number 2 and island number 3. So instead of doing the steps again from scratch, what we're going to do now is you can select the island number 1 obj, right click, and select onto duplicate. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do now is we'll be renaming your object name. So island number 2 underscore obj. Okay, then we'll be changing the assigned sprite. Okay, just click OK. Now we have your second island. Let's repeat this procedure. Okay, rename your island. So island 3 underscore obj. Then change its sprite. Now after doing that, so we already have your 3 objects. Now the next thing What we want to do is we want to add this additional two objects onto your room, and let's check what will be the output. So island number 2, I'll be placing it around in here, and your island number 3 will be in here. Okay, so we have 3 islands as of the moment. Click check to finalize the changes that we've made. Then let's run your game. So this is now your output. So as you can see, we have 3 scrolling islands that appears randomly within your map. Okay, so this is the procedures that you'll be needing to create your scrolling background. So as a whole, the water background and the islands serves as the background for the whole game. So this is what we call your scrolling backgrounds. Okay. Okay guys, so let's continue. So the next step that we'll be doing now is we'll be starting with your controller plane. Now to do that, the first thing that we need to settle will be to create your sprite for your controller plane. So let's say for example, I'll be using the sprite name controller underscore plane. Okay, underscore SPR to denote that this is a sprite. Okay, so let's find your controller plane. So this is the sprite that we'll be using for your controller plane. Okay, just click onto the open button. The next thing that we need to do now is we need to define its origin. It should be in the center. Okay, then click OK. So after doing your sprite, the next thing that we need to do is we'll be creating the object for your controller plane. So on your resource tree, right click onto objects. Okay, then let's rename this to controller underscore plane underscore obj to denote that this is an object. Okay, so let's select the assigned, or let us assign the sprite that we'll be using. So we'll be using this controller plane SPR. Okay, then we'll be changing its depth. So previously the islands, we assigned a depth of 100 onto them. Okay, for your island we'll be using negative 100. So the positive value or the objects with the depth of positive values will be drawn first onto your game. So the negative value depth will be drawn last. Okay, so we want your plane to be above the islands. Okay, so we'll be selecting the depth to 100. Next is we'll be adding controls now for your controller plane. So how do we add the controls? So as I mentioned earlier, so the controllers that we'll be using for your plane will be your arrow keys. So we have your down, up, left, and right. So first we'll be starting with your left. So to do that, you can proceed onto the add event button, click add event button, proceed to the keyboard. Okay, then it will be showing you a list of the different keyboard buttons that you can use as controllers. So first we'll be using left. So we already have your left event now. So what we're going to do, once the player clicks onto the left arrow key, now what we're going to do now is we'll be creating an action to test a variable. Okay, so to do that, you can proceed with control. Okay, so under the control tab, okay, we have your variables group. So we want to use this test variable. Okay, so we'll be adding this test variable. Okay, so the variable that we'll be testing is x. Okay, so why x? Because the left and right, okay, will be moving from left to right onto the x-axis. Okay, so we'll be defining the variable x, okay, for your movement for the left and right button. So we'll be setting variable x. Okay, then we'll be assigning a value of 30. So 30 now, guys, we'll be defining the value of 30 in here. It will define the border on how right or left can you move onto the map. So let's say, for example, we don't want our plane to move outside. Okay, the room. So we'll be defining this value. So the plane now can move into the maximum of 30 pixels onto the border. Okay, so it cannot move outside your room. So we'll be checking this later. Okay, so for now, I'll be assigning a value of 30. Then the operation that we'll be using is greater than. Okay, then I'll click OK. So after this is your test variable. The next thing that we want to do now is to create a jump position. So this is like what we did onto the islands. Okay, so we'll be moving from left to right. So we'll be defining we'll be defining one of these coordinates in here. So as we've mentioned, when you're moving from left to right, we'll be using the x coordinate or the x-axis. So we'll be moving negative or 4 pixels onto the left. So we'll be defining that 4 pixels, okay? So for it to move to left, we'll be using a negative value, okay? So we'll be leaving the value of y to 0 and we'll be checking this relative, meaning the value for x can stop. So it can move from left. So just click OK. Now, what we're going to do now is let's check if we can control your plane now using the left arrow key. Okay, so I'll just click OK. So we have your controller plane now. So before we can proceed, first thing that we need to do now is we want to add your controller plane onto the room. So select your controller plane and drag it where you want it to be. So I'll be dragging my plane onto the center of the room. Okay, click OK to finalize the changes and let's run your game. Okay, now guys, so as you can see, okay, your plane is stationary. What's moving now is your background. Now, I'll be using my left arrow keys to move, okay, the plane. Okay, now, it won't be moving outside. As you can hear, I'm clicking onto my left arrow key, but as you can see, it can't move outside the room because we've defined that your plane can only move unto a maximum of 30 pixels. So, why is it the plane is already on the border? You'll have to remember, guys, that we define these pixels to be the center, to have its origin on the center. Okay, not on the leftmost side. Okay, the center origin for this island is 30. So you can assume that the space from here up until here is 30 pixels. That's why your plane can only move up until this point. Okay, so now let's proceed. So after adding your left arrow key controller, we'll be proceeding with your right. So click onto the add event button, proceed onto keyboard and select right. So we'll be doing the same procedure. So in here, we'll be testing your variable. So you can proceed with the control tab. Under your variables group, select onto the test variable. Okay? Yes, we'll be selecting or we'll be using the same variable. That will be your x, but we'll be changing its value now. So earlier, we defined the value to be 30 for it not to move to the leftmost right to 30 pixels. Now we'll be using an expression in here. So we'll be using room width. Okay. Then we'll be deducting a max value of 30 for it not to move outside the room. Okay. So let's repeat the variable. The variable that we'll be using is x. The value will be the room width minus 30 pixels. Okay. Then the operation that we'll be using is less than. Okay. Just click OK. Then we'll also be using the same action for it to move. Okay, so we'll be using this. So this is the jump position action. So drag it onto your actions list. Okay, now previously for the left, we used a negative value for your x. In here, we'll be using a positive value for it to move from left to right. Okay, so we'll be using a positive value for your x, 0 for your y, and we'll be checking this relative and click OK. So let's try to run this. I'll click OK, then let's try to run your game. Let's see if we can control now your plane from left to right. So as you can see, when the game starts, the plane sits on the middle of your room. So as you can see now, we can control your plane using the left and right cursor keys. Okay. Now, if you want to speed up the movement of your plane, you can change the value for X. Okay, so let's say for example, okay, so for the left and right, we defined the jump position value for X to be 4. If you want your plane to move faster than 4 pixels per click, you can change this to 10. Let's say for example, I'll be changing the X value for left to, let's say, 20. Okay. Then I'll be leaving the right jump position value for X to 4. So let's see what will happen. Okay, now, so this is your game now. So if we move our plane from to right, okay, so that is its speed. But if we'll be using the left, it will be a lot faster. Okay, that is because we've changed the value for your X coordinate for the left key. Okay, now it's up to you what value you want to use. Okay, just remember that for now, I'll be using 4 to increase the difficulty of your game. Okay, so I'll be using -4 for its value. Okay, let's proceed now. So the next thing that we'll be adding is the controller for your up arrow key. Okay, so select on the keyboard, click up. Okay, then we'll be doing the same procedure. First thing that we need to do is proceed to score, then our control will be testing your variable. Now, for up and down, we'll be using the variable y because it will be moving along the y-axis. So now for the value, I'll be assigning 40. Okay, then the procedure or the operation that we'll be using is greater than. Then click OK. Then proceed to move tab and jump to position. Okay, so previously we defined the value for X to -4 and +4. So for up and down, we won't be changing the value for your X because we'll be defining the Y coordinate. So as I mentioned earlier, we'll be moving along the Y coordinate or the Y axis. So the value that we'll be using for your Y is -4. Okay, for it to move up, then click onto the relative box. Okay, and click OK. Now, so we have your up. The next thing that we'll be doing is the down cursor. Okay, once the event for the down cursor is added, we'll be doing the same procedure. Okay, we proceed to control. We'll be testing a variable. So the variable that we'll be using is y, and the value that we'll be using now is, instead of using 40, we'll be using the room height. Okay, room_height, but we'll be limiting it to less than 100 pixels because onto the lower part we'll be adding a scoreboard. Okay, so we'll be using this 100 pixels below the room to create your scoreboard. Okay, the operation that we'll be using is less than. Okay, so we have your less than now. Then click OK. Then we proceed to move. Then we'll be adding your move to position. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we'll be using the Y coordinate for this one. So we'll be adding a positive value. Okay, and click the relative checkbox. Click OK. Then let's try to run your game now. Okay, so this is our game now. So as you can see, we can move your plane from left to right and up to down. Okay, so your plane can only move up onto here. This space in here will be around 40 pixels. This is what we defined earlier. Okay, then below, so this space from here is around 100 pixels. So why we added 100 pixels in here and 40 pixels in here? So we'll be using this 100 pixels to add your scoreboard. Okay? So we'll be adding your health bar in here later and also your score. Okay? So we'll be using this space for the scoreboard. So as you can see now, guys, we can already control your plane. So the next thing that we'll be doing now is we'll be proceeding in creating the bullet for your plane. Now, so to do that, first we'll be starting with creating your sprite. Okay, so sprite first. So let's close this. I'll be creating your sprite. So right click on the sprites folder onto your resource tree. Select create sprite. Okay, we'll be renaming this to bullet underscore SPR. Let's load the image of the bullet. This is your image now. Let's select this and click open. And lastly, we'll be defining its origin to be in the center. And then click OK. Now, after creating your sprite resource, we'll be proceeding in creating your object now. So, onto your resource tree, right-click onto the objects folder, select create object, then we'll be adding your bullet underscore obj object. Okay, let's assign a sprite, so that will be your bullet sprite. Okay, then the next thing that we'll be doing now is we'll be setting its depth. So we'll be setting its depth to 0. So as you remember, the islands will have a positive 100 value for the depth. Okay, the plane will have a negative 100 for the depth. And for the bullet, it will be depth 0. Okay? So now let's continue. So after creating your object for the bullet, the next thing that we'll be doing is we'll be adding your events. So click on your add event button, select create. Okay? We want your bullet to move, okay, from bottom to top because your controller plane sits onto the middle, and we want your enemies, or we want to shoot your enemies from the location of the plane to the top. It will be moving from bottom to the top. Okay. So now to do that, so under your create event, we'll be using the move fix action. So under your move tab and move group, select move fix. Okay, so the direction that your bullet will be from bottom to top. So we'll only be using this arrow. Then we'll also be defining its speed. So for the speed, we'll be using 10. Okay, then we'll be checking onto this relative. Okay, just click OK. Now, after your bullet is created, okay, it will be moving from the location of your plane to the top. Now, the next thing that we'll be doing is we want to destroy the bullet once it leaves the room. So if we don't destroy the bullet, okay, once it leaves the room, it stays within the game and it eats resources. It eats the RAM, even though that we can use and we can see the bullets that are outside the room. So we'll be adding a destroy instance for this particular object. So to do that, we'll be adding a new event. So the event that we'll be using is others and outside room. Again, so click on the, so to do that, click on the add button, select the others and outside room. Okay, so we'll be adding a destroy instance action. So to do that, we can proceed to main tab. Okay, we have your objects group. Then you have this action, destroy instance. So to do that, make sure that the bullet or the option for self will be selected. Meaning, it will be destroying its self once it is outside the room. Then, just click OK. So, as of now, we have two events. So, each of this event will have one corresponding action. Okay. Now, so after doing this, just click OK. Then we can now proceed again to the controller plane object. So previously, we've defined that the player can use the left, up, right, down button to move your plane. So now we'll be using spacebar to fire your bullet. So select on to add event, keyboard, then we'll be using space. Okay. So after doing that, the next thing that we'll be doing now is we'll be creating an instance. Okay, so what is an instance? So an instance is a copy of an object within your room or within your game. So to do that, you can proceed to main one. Okay, you can see this light bulb button. Okay, this is your create instance action. So drag it onto the actions panel. Okay, so these are the values that we'll be using. So for the x and y coordinates, we'll be using 0. Okay, then the object that we want to create or an instance that we want to create is the bullet. So meaning, once the spacebar is clicked, your GameMaker Studio now will be creating an instance or a copy of your bullet OBJ. So where will it appear? We're not defining the x and y coordinates of the bullet, but we'll be using relative, meaning it will be using the location of the plane as the x and y coordinate for your bullet. Okay, so we'll click OK. Then let's try to run your game. Okay, now, so as you can see, we can move your plane left, right, down, and up. So once you press onto the space bar, you can see that it'll be emitting a bullet. Now the problem in this particular instance is we're not setting any values on how many bullets can the plane fire at a single time. As you can see, I can spam my bullets. So we'll be fixing that. Okay, so for now, let's close this one. Okay, so to address the issue of the bullet spamming, what we're going to do now is we'll be using a variable that will be limiting the bullets that the player can use. Okay, instead of spamming too much bullet, we'll be limiting the number of bullets to 3 per second. Now, so to do that, okay, for your space event, we'll be adding a test variable. Okay, test variable action. So the variable that we'll be using is the can shoot. Okay, so later we'll be defining the can shoot onto the next event. So for now, we'll be testing it. So I'll be defining can shoot. Okay, then the value will be true. The operation will be equal to. Okay, now the stockings of the actions is we want the conditional statement to be on the first of your actions. Okay, in this particular scenario, okay, if this condition is met, it will be only executing the next action that we have. But let's say, for example, we want to execute multiple actions based on this conditional statement, we'll be using blocks. So to do that, you can proceed to control. Under your others group, you have your start a block and end a block. So we want the start block to be added before your create instance. Okay, so after creating the instance, the next procedure that we'll be doing is we'll be creating a set variable. So we'll be using this action, set variable, drag it onto here. Okay, the variable name is can shoot. Okay, then the value will be false. Okay, so meaning once the bullet is created or once the spacebar is clicked and the bullet is created, the shoot variable will change its value to false. So meaning if the value is false, then we cannot create an instance of the bullet, meaning we cannot draw a bullet when you click your spacebar. So it must be change its value from false to true. Later, we'll be doing that. So for now, we'll be changing its value to false. Then the next thing that we'll be doing now is we'll be creating an alarm. So to do that, you can proceed with the main 2 tab under your timings group, set alarm. Okay, drag the set alarm in here. So the number of steps that we'll be using is 10. So I've shown you earlier the settings for our room. So the size of our room is 640 by 480 pixels. Okay, and also the number of steps is 30 per second. So I'll be showing that after finishing this. So the number of steps is 10. So the alarm number that we'll be using is 0. Just click OK. Then we'll be adding your end block. Okay, so let's go back to the room. So as I've mentioned earlier, the width is 640 by 480 pixels. Then we have your speed in here. So the speed is the number of steps per second. So meaning we have 30 steps per second in this game. Okay, so for our set alarm, we've defined that the number of steps for our alarm to activate is 10. Okay? So later, we'll be setting up your alarm that when every 10 second passes, we'll be changing the value of the can shoot. Okay? So we'll be changing it from false. As of this line, the value for our can shoot is false. Okay? We'll be changing its value to true every 10 steps. Now to do that, okay, we'll just press OK. Okay? Then we'll be adding 2 more events. So the first event that we'll be adding is the create event. Okay, so after the create event, guys, we'll be adding your set variable. So now we can declare here the variables that we used earlier. So we'll be defining the variable name to be can shoot, then its value to be true. Okay? So after defining the variable or declaring the variable now, the next thing that we'll be doing is we'll be adding the alarm. So the alarm, okay, this will provide the countdown timer on how many steps it will take for you to re-execute the loop. So as you can see, we have alarm 0 in here, we have alarm in 0 in here, so it will be creating a loop. Okay? So now, what are the actions or what is the action that we'll be adding for your alarm 0? We'll be setting a variable now. Okay, so let's proceed to control, set a variable. Okay, so the variable is can shoot. Okay, and we'll be assigning it a value of true. So now, if the alarm in here triggers, okay, or the space button is click and triggers, okay, it will be drawing the instance, changing the value of the can shoot to false, and will be having a countdown timer of 10 steps. So once that 10 step lapse, it will be proceeding to alarm 0 to change the value again from false to true. Okay, so let's check the output of this events and actions. So we have now your plane. Okay, so now as you can see, guys, even though I hold down onto the spacebar, it will only be emitting 3 bullets per second. So you can limit the number of bullets that your plane can emit now. Unlike the previous versions wherein the player can spam too many bullets. Okay, so as you can see, we've fixed now your bullets. Okay, so after resolving the bullet issue with your controller plane, now we'll be proceeding with the explosion event when the bullet collides with the enemy plane. So to do that, the first thing that we need to prepare will be the audios that we'll be using for the explosion. So under your assets folder, you'll be having 2 explosion sounds. So we have sound underscore explosion 1. So we'll be using this one for the bullet collision explosion. Okay. The next one, okay, we will be using the second audio for the collision of the plane, of the enemy plane to the controller plane. So plane underscore collision underscore explosion underscore SND. Okay. Now, after creating your sound files, the next thing that we'll be doing is we'll be adding sprite for the initial explosion. Okay, or for the explosion when the bullet collides with the enemy plane. Okay, so we'll be naming that to bullet collision underscore explosion underscore SPR. Okay, so we'll be using explosion 1. Okay, then click open. We'll be setting its origin to center. Okay, then we'll click OK. So the next procedure that we'll be doing now is we'll be adding your object for the explosion. So let's say we'll be creating the bullet, collision underscore explosion underscore obj. Okay, we'll be assigning the sprite for the bullet collision. Okay, so the next thing that we'll be doing now is we'll be adding now your events. So the events that we'll be doing here is the animation end. So you can proceed with add event button, select others, then animation end. So after the bullet or after the explosion happened, we want it to be destroyed. Okay, so you can proceed to main one. Okay, select onto destroy instance. Okay, then make sure that self is selected. Then click OK. Then we're done with your bullet collision explosion. So the next thing that we'll be doing now is we want to add the collision, okay, of the enemy plane with your bullet. So to do that, we'll be proceeding back to the enemy plane. We'll be adding your collision now, okay? So as of the moment, we only have 2 events in here. So to create your collision, you can proceed to add event, okay? Select collision and what object you want it to be colliding. So let's say for example, we'll be colliding it onto the bullet, okay? So select bullet obj. Now, the next thing that we'll be doing now is we'll be adding your audio of the explosion. So under main one, select play sound, okay? Then we'll be selecting bullet collision explosion. We'll leave the loop value as false, okay? Then we'll be proceeding to main number, or we'll be proceeding to main number 1, okay, to select this destroy instance. So to select this destroy instance, you can go to main 1 under your objects group. So we'll be dragging it in here. Make sure that the value selected is set. Click OK. Okay, so the next procedure now is we'll be creating the instance for the bullet collision. So to do that, you can proceed to main 1 under objects group. We have your create instance. Okay, so we'll drag this create instance. Okay, then the object that we'll be defining now is the bullet collision explosion. Okay, now we won't be changing the values for your x and y, but we want to check the checkbox for relative. So what will happen now, the explosion will happen on the collision of the actual main plane. So the explosion will happen on the enemy plane, on the enemy plane. Okay, make sure that the x and y values are 0 and the relative checkbox is checked. Then click OK. Then after doing that, okay, we'll be proceeding to move. We'll be adding the jump position. Okay, so select on jump position. Okay, so what we'll be doing now is we want to relocate your enemy plane outside, okay, outside the room. So for the x value, we'll be using random underscore range. Okay, then the values that we'll be using is 16 to 620. Okay, then the value for y is negative 65. Okay, then the last part now is we'll be setting the score. So when the bullet collides with the enemy plane, so it will be creating the explosion. Okay, it will be removing the enemy plane and the score should be raised to 5. So we'll be setting the score. So under your score group, okay, or score tab, then score group, you have your set score. So drag your set score into your actions panel. Then we'll be giving it a new score. So we'll be assigning 5 as the new score, and we want it to be relative because we want our score to stack up. Okay? So we'll click OK. Click OK in here. Then let's check. Okay, so let's try to run your game. Okay, so this is the game now. So you can see we still don't have a collision event for the two planes. Okay, the collision event that we've added is for the bullet and the enemy plane. So as you can see, once the enemy is hit, okay, it will be exploding. So let's try that again. Okay. Okay, so as you can see, we can already now destroy your enemy plane. Okay. Okay, guys. So just a quick correction regarding the things that we set up for the bullet collision. Okay. So make sure that the destroy the instance, the value that is selected is other. Okay. So we want to select we want the bullet to be destroyed. Okay, so let's try to rerun that again. Okay, so what should happen now is once the bullet collides with the enemy plane, okay, the enemy plane will be placed randomly above the screen, and we want our bullet to be destroyed. Okay, so let's wait for another plane. Okay. Okay, so as you can see, we already have your audio playing, and our bullet now already destroys itself once it hits the enemy plane. Okay. Now, so we'll be proceeding with the next step. So for the next step, we'll be doing the second explosion. That will be the explosion that happens when our controller plane collides with the enemy plane. So to do that, we'll be creating the sprite that we'll be needing for your plane collision. So I'll be naming the sprite to plane collision underscore explosion underscore SPR. Okay, then we'll be using the strip number 2 for the explosion sprite. Just click open. Okay, we want the center of, or we want the origin to be in center. Then click OK. So the next procedure now, after creating your sprite, is we'll be now creating your object. Okay, so we want the name of this object to plane underscore collision underscore explosion. Okay. Now, so what we're going to do now is we'll be setting the sprite that we'll be using for this one. So this will be the plane collision or plane collision explosion. Okay. Then after that, we'll be creating now your event. So the first event that we'll be doing is the animation end. So you can click on the add event button, select others, then animation end. So for the action that we'll be using the play sound. Okay, so you have your play sound in your main one tab under your sounds group. So drag your play sound action to the actions list. Okay, then we'll be defining the plane collision explosion sound. We don't want to loop this one, so we'll be leaving the default value as false. So we'll click OK. So after doing that, we'll be now creating a display message. Okay, so for the initial part or for testing part, what we're going to do now is once the enemy plane collides with the controller plane, we want the game to be over. So to do that, we can proceed with main 2. Okay, so the first event that we'll be using is the display message. So we'll be using this. So we'll drag this to the actions list and we'll be displaying a message to your player. So let's say, for example, we'll be using the message game over. Okay, so after doing that, we want the game to be restarted. So under the games group, you have your restart game. Okay, so this is now the actions that we'll be doing under the animation end. Okay, so we'll click OK. Now, as of the moment, we still don't have the collision. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we'll be going back to the enemy plane. Okay, so let's proceed with the enemy plane. Okay, now we'll be doing the collision. So the collision with the controller plane. So as you can see, we already did the collision of the enemy plane to the bullet. So now we'll be adding collision against the controller plane. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we'll be adding the play sound. Okay, so let's say for example, we can proceed to main one, play the sound. Okay, so the sound that we'll be using is the plane collision. Okay, we'll click OK. So we'll be leaving the loop value to false. Okay, so the next is we'll be destroying an instance. Okay, so under main one. Okay, so we'll be using this destroy instance. So for the destroy instance, we'll be using self. Okay, so we'll be destroying now your enemy plane. So just click OK. Then the next procedure is we'll be creating an instance. Okay, so create instance under your main one objects group, create instance. Okay, then now we'll be calling the plane explosion in here. So the object that we'll be selecting is the plane explosion. We'll be leaving the value for x and y to 0, but make sure to check the checkbox for the relative. Okay, we'll click OK. Click OK in here. Then let's try to run your game. Okay. Okay, so this is the game now. So as you can see, it will be displaying game over. So let's try to move it. Okay, so you can move your plane then. So as you can see, when the two planes, when the controller plane and the enemy plane collides, you can move over. Okay, so you can avoid that by shooting or evading the enemy plane. So let's collide the next plane that we'll be seeing. Okay, so displaying the message game over, and when you click game over or the OK, then it will be restarting the game. Okay, now so that is the collision for your plane. So the next thing that we'll be doing now is we'll be creating a mechanism, okay, that will be creating multiple planes instead of one plane, or that will be creating multiple enemy planes instead of just one enemy plane. Okay, so to do that, we'll be creating a new object. Okay, so let's create an object. The name of your object will be controller underscore enemy underscore obj. Okay, so we won't be using a sprite in here. Okay, then we'll be proceeding with the event. So we'll be using the create event. Okay, so for the create event, we'll be creating an instance. So you can proceed to main one. Under objects group, we have your create instance. Okay, so for the object that we'll be creating is we'll be recreating an enemy plane. Okay, so we want to create multiple enemy planes in the game. So we'll be selecting enemy plane obj. Okay, then we'll be changing its x and y values. For x, we'll be using random underscore range. Okay, the values that we'll be using is same with the earlier one, so that will be 16 and 620. For the y, it's negative 65. Okay, so let's click OK. Then we'll be adding an alarm in here. So we want your alarms to be looping as we did earlier. So you can proceed to main 1. Or we can proceed to main 2. Under timings, you have your set alarm. Okay, so the number of steps. So how many seconds do you want your plane to reappear? Okay, so let's say for example, we want this to be something faster. So we want the second plane, so on and so forth, to appear every, let's say, 30 steps. Okay, so for this particular instance, we'll be using alarm number 1 because we already used alarm number 0. Okay, then we'll just click OK. So the next thing that we'll be doing is we'll be creating the alarm event. So alarm, then we'll be using alarm 1. So the first action is we'll also be creating an instance in here. So we'll be creating an instance of your enemy plane. So for the values that we'll be using, that will be similar that we used earlier. So random underscore range 16 620. Okay, for the y we'll be using negative 65. Okay, then we'll also be adding an alarm in here. So we'll be adding an alarm. So for now, instead of using 30, we'll be using 60 for your alarm or number of steps, 60, then alarm number 1, then click OK. Okay, so just click OK. Now to do now, or the next thing to do now is we'll be proceeding again to your room. Okay, now what we're going to do now is we want to delete the enemy plane that we placed earlier. So select the enemy plane, right click, then delete. Okay, what we're going to do is we'll be adding the controller enemy object. Okay, so I'll be adding it in the upper right corner. Okay, so as you can see, it won't be having a sprite, so it will look something like this. So let's check what will happen if we execute this controller enemy object. So let's play your game. Okay, so for now, I won't be shooting any planes. So as you can see, you'll be having multiple planes, enemy planes at the same time in here. So it will be adding an additional difficulty level. As the game progresses, the number of planes will continue to increase. Okay, adding for the difficulty level. So you need to be careful in this part of the game. So as you can see, you have too many planes in here. Okay, if you want to reduce the number of planes in here, all you need to do is to change the alarm step that you're adding. So let's say, for example, under the create event, you can change this to, let's say, 100. Then for alarm 1, we'll be changing the number of steps to 115. Let's check what will be the difference. Okay, so this is our game now. So as you can see, as of now, we already have 1. Okay, but as time progresses, it will continue to increase, but not as fast as the earlier version that we had. So for this example, I'll be leaving its value to 100 and 150. Okay. Now, the next thing that we'll be doing after the enemies is we'll be creating now the scoreboard. So the scoreboard, we'll be using the scoreboard to show the score of the player and the health of your plane. Now, so to do that, what we're going to do is we need to create a sprite for your scoreboard. So let's say, for example, I'll be naming the sprite to scoreboard underscore SPR. Then I'll be loading an image in here. So in your assets folder, you can see this bottom.png. So this is the image that we'll be using as your scoreboard. So this image already contains the label for the score. Okay, and the logo of 1945 on the lower right corner. So let's click open. Okay, then we'll click OK. So the next procedure that we'll be doing now is we'll be creating another object that is responsible in drawing your scoreboard. Okay, so let's create a new object. So we'll be renaming this to controller underscore life underscore obj. Okay, so the next thing that we'll be doing now is we won't be setting a sprite in here. Okay, we won't be using this one, but we'll be using a draw action for your sprite. So we'll be doing that later. So first is let's change its depth. So we'll be changing its depth to negative 10,000 because we want this controller light to sit above all our components and objects. within your 1945 game. So we want this to be on top of all the objects that we have on your game. So the next thing that we'll be doing is we'll be adding an event. So we'll be adding your create event. So for the create event, what we'll be dealing now here is we want to create the we want to set the score and we want to set your health. So first, we'll be adding your score. So for the score, we'll be using 0 for the new score and we'll leave it as it is. Okay? So just set the score. We're also setting the health. Okay, we'll set the health by default to 100. Okay, so as you can see, we set the score to 0. We set the health to 100. The next thing that we'll be doing now is we'll be using an event that will be drawing our sprite. Okay, so let's click your draw event, then select draw. So under this event, what we're going to do now is we'll be using an action that will be drawing our sprite. Okay, so that will be this action. So you can select the draw tab under drawing, then under drawing group, you can select draw sprite. So drag your draw sprite onto your actions list. Then these are the values that we'll be using. So the sprite that we'll be drawing or that we'll be adding is your scoreboard SPR. Okay, then we'll be changing its X and Y values. So this will determine the location where the scoreboard will appear. Then if you want to select the actual scoreboard sprite frame, we'll be leaving the value to the value of sub image to -1. Okay, so we'll just click OK. Then after adding your sprite or draw sprite, we'll be proceeding with adding the color theme. So we'll be using set color. Okay, so for the color that we'll be using is yellow. So select yellow on your palette, click OK, then click OK. So the next thing that we'll be doing now is we'll draw your score and we'll draw your health bar. So you can proceed to score tab. Okay, then we'll be drawing now your score. So use this action, so draw score. Okay, so we'll be defining now where will your score be drawn. So let's say for example, the X and Y coordinate or the location will be 180 and 40. So for now, we'll be removing the caption because we already have the caption onto the image or the sprite. Okay, then we'll click OK. After drawing your score, we'll now draw your health. Okay, so select on draw health. Okay, the first two values or the X1 and Y1 corresponds to position and the X2 and Y2 corresponds for the size. So for the position, for X1, we'll be adding the value 12, Y1 is 449, X2 is 138. Okay, for the Y2 is Y5 or 459. So we'll be leaving the back color and bar color as default. Okay, then we'll click OK. So what we're going to do now is we'll check if our scoreboard will be drawn. Okay, let's click OK. Okay, so to check if your controller is drawn onto your room, what we're going to do now is we'll be proceeding to the main room. So what we're going to do is we want to add your controller like object onto your room. So I'll be adding it on the lower left corner. So as you can see, it won't be having a sprite. Okay, so that's okay. So I'll click check, finalize the changes. Then let's try to run your game if we'll be seeing your scoreboard. Okay, so this is your scoreboard now below. Okay, so this is your score. Then you have your health bar in here. So as of the moment, only the score works. So our health bar doesn't work because once the enemy plane collides with our controller plane, it already finishes the game. So we want to change that. So what we're going to do is we'll be utilizing this health bar. So as you can see, we define the health bar to have the value of 100. So what we're going to do now is every hit of the enemy plane to the controller plane, we want to deduct a score of 30. So meaning, at least, or meaning, for enemy plane hits will end the game. Okay? So what we're going to do now? So let's go back to the enemy plane. Okay? So what we're going to do now is we'll be changing its collision with the controller plane. Okay? So what are we going to do? So we'll be adding a destroy instance. So to do that, proceed to main one. Okay? Select this destroy instance. Okay? Drag it in here. Then we'll be changing its value or default value to others or other. Click OK. So I'll be moving that in here. Then I'll be adding the set health. So you can proceed the score tab. Okay. Then we'll be using this action, set health. So the value that we'll be adding now is negative 30. This is the value that will be removing to your actual health. So the health as of the moment is 100. So we want to reduce your health to negative 30 and we want it to be stacking. So we'll be checking on to relative. Okay? Then we'll click OK and OK. So the next procedure that we'll be doing now is we'll be going back to your controller live. Okay. So what we're going to do in here is first, we'll be adding an event. So the event that we'll be adding is no more health. So you can proceed to add event, others, then no more health. So what will happen if your controller plane loses all its HP? So what we're going to do now is we want to display a message that the game is over and restart it. So adding the game over message in here. Okay, then restart the game. So as you've seen previously, we already did this. The previous display message and restart game will be removing that later. Okay, so after doing that, we'll click OK. Then what we're going to do now is we'll be proceeding to the plane explosion. Okay, plane explosion OBJ. So what we're going to do, this is the display or the initial display message and restart game that we've added previously. So what we're going to do now is we'll be deleting all these three. Okay. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we'll be adding an action destroy instance. Okay. So we can proceed to main one. So destroy instance, then we'll be destroying the collision explosion. So we'll be selecting self, then we'll be adding a create instance. Okay, so the create instance for the object will be using the controller plane to redraw it again. Okay, so instead of destroying the enemy plane, okay, so we'll just redraw it using the create instance. So we'll be leaving the x and y values to be 0, but we want to check this relative box. Okay, so when the initial plane collides with enemy plane, okay, it will explode, but it will reappear again. But it will be deducting its health. Okay, so we'll click OK in here, then let's try to run your game. Okay, so this is your game now. So let's try to... Okay, so as you can see, we can destroy your enemy planes. Let's try to collide to one of them. Okay, let's wait. Okay, as you can see, your health bar now will be reduced to 30. But your plane is still in here. It was redrawn again where it exploded. So let's try to hit again. Okay. So as you can see, I can still have one collision. Okay, for the fourth collision now, the game will be over. Okay, so let's collide onto one. Okay, now the game will be over. So, guys, this is the end of our discussion for this 1945 tutorial. This is just an initial version. Okay, so it's up to you now how you're going to improve this. Okay, on your end. So I'll be giving you the sprite, I'll be providing you the installer, I'll be providing you step-by-step procedure on how to do this. If you want to do this at home, then you can do so. Okay guys, so after that tutorial for 1945, I'll be showing you how to create an exported game. Okay, so in here guys, you have your target up here. So as of now, our target is in Windows, but you can select other platforms in here. Okay, so let's say for example, you want to create an exported game. So let's say for example, we'll be using HTML5, okay, for the target. You can proceed with file, then create an application. Okay, now you'll be exporting an HTML file or folder of this game. So let's say for example, I'll be adding that to this exported folder. Okay, so let's say I'll be renaming it to demo 1945. I'll click save. Okay, then it will be exporting now an HTML version of the game that you created. So let's say for example, I'll be asking you to pass a game. What you're going to do now is I want you to pass the exported one, not the GMX file. Okay, so let's say for example, let's check onto that. So I have created the exported folder. Okay, so as you can see, this is now the exported game. So I'll try to open it with, let's say, Google Chrome. Okay, so this is your game now. Okay, so as you can see, you can now play your game using a web browser. Okay, this is now your exported file. So let's say for example, you'll be submitting. Okay, so let's say for example, you'll be submitting me a game. You can export the game onto the platform that you want to use it. Okay, so let's say for example, aside from HTML5, you can have Windows. You can also have Android. Okay, but before exporting the game to Android, make sure that you have the proper SDK and JDK before you export it. Okay, so I suggest if you'll be submitting you will be submitting a game that you'll be creating, it's either on HTML5 or Windows installer. Okay, so let's say Windows file, create application. Okay, so the installer will look something like this. So let's say single runtime executable for an executable file. So sample application. So I'll be naming it sample application. Click save. Okay, so it will be exporting now. Okay, so we'll be seeing that. Then let's check our export. Okay, now you'll have your installer in here. Okay, so this is now a Windows installer for the game that you created. So again, when you're submitting your game, I want it to be an application or to be an HTML file. Okay, so why am I demonstrating how to export your game? That is because, guys, you'll be having your final project. Okay, so your final project will be to recreate a classic arcade game using GameMaker Studio. So what type of classic arcade game? It could be a Pac-Man or 1945, Tetris, or etc. So now, if you'll be doing 1945, it should be an upgraded version to the tutorial that we did. Okay, so it should have, let's say, multiple levels, multiple enemies. Okay, the game should at least have 2 playing levels. The target playing time to finish the game should be at 15 minutes of playtime. So create your own sprites for the desired game. Create a group that has 10 members. The complete guidelines and rubrics for the final project will be available in the link below. So kindly check the complete guidelines and the rubrics at the link below of this video. Okay, if you have additional questions regarding your final project, send me a private message. Okay, that's it for today, guys. Thank you for coming in here. Bye.